So yeah, hi, I'm Rowan, Disability and Neurodiversity Inclusion Officer for Equality Network, which is an LGBTI equalities org in Scotland. And I'm autistic and physically disabled myself, because we're all about the lived experience. We are currently doing a survey for disabled and neurodivergent LGBTI folk to inform our work. And although it's not quite finished yet, in fact, because it's not quite finished yet, I thought I would talk about it because you also have the opportunity to still fill it in if you get in there before the end of the month. So I'm going to paste the link to the survey into the chat here. It's explicitly for people who are LGBTI and neurodivergent and or disabled, depending on whether you consider your neurodivergence to be a disability. And it's specifically for people in Scotland, so it won't be completely for everybody in the chat, but it's there if you want. And we have some sort of preliminary results already because it's been out a while, that I thought might be interesting for folk. So in the survey, we don't explicitly distinguish between different flavors of neurodivergence, except where people have chosen to use the more information box to specify. But we have noticed that the vast majority of the people who have specified so far have included autism. And there's so much overlap between so many of these supposedly different conditions that I don't have any compunction about just looking at the results for everybody who's ticked neurodivergent. So I filtered for that. And then we're sort of looking at things like, well, what we've asked in the survey is we've asked about access and inclusion in a bunch of ways, in community things like groups and meetups that people might want to take part in, as well as in policy and decision making and being involved in decisions about things that affect us. So some of the findings that we've had, well, the first one that I was fascinated by, because I'm non-binary myself, is that 45% of our responses were non-binary, out of people who tick neurodivergent. And I just think, yeah, there's an awful lot of us, much more than you might find in the general population. And I know that we're sampling people who are LGBTI specifically, so there's obviously some sample bias there, but that's still a heck of a lot. And out of our responses, we had about 50-50 who defined as trans or not trans. And given that not all non-binary people define as trans, that's also a pretty high number. We've asked whether people are in touch with any communities or social groups where they feel particularly welcomed or included as LGBTI, neurodivergent, disabled people. Good news is that 72% of people have said yes, which seems great, but it might well include some sample bias because obviously we had to get in touch with those people somehow. And if people are not at all in touch with groups that might pass on the information to them, we're much less likely to find them. But we also asked, do you feel able to get involved in conversations about how decision makers can improve or change living in Scotland? So we're talking about Scottish Government, your local councils, anybody that controls the service that you need. And only 34% of people said yes to that. People didn't really feel that they could get involved in conversations or knew where the conversations were taking place. So we had 51% no and 15% just said they don't know. And quite a few people said they didn't know how they were supposed to even start on that. So that's an area we clearly need to work on in multiple ways. I mean, obviously we can't completely reinvent politics by ourselves, but Equality Network does quite a lot of work on policy and engaging with policymakers. So we're going to make sure they know that and talk to them about some of the ways that things could be more accessible or could reach the right sorts of groups. I mean, and people did have concerns about policies and services. It wasn't because they didn't care. So some of their main areas of concern were things like trans healthcare, which is obviously a hugely difficult area at the moment, social care or getting access to care workers, benefits and the cost of living, which is massive for a lot of us. COVID safety was quite a big one. People felt that people were no longer taking any precautions and that they felt that very few places were safe for them. And again, a general discrimination and lack of access to places was a big concern. So we asked about people's engagement with LGBTI and neurodivergent groups and services. Some of the main reasons that people didn't engage with groups and services include neurodivergent groups and services included a lack of diagnosis, because some services are only limited to people who already have a diagnosis, and a lack of physical access, especially we got several people mention number 6 in Edinburgh, which I know I personally can't get into. Quite a few people also wanted better COVID safety there and didn't feel safe going to any in-person groups without it. And people were also concerned about LGBTI inclusion, especially trans inclusion, including whether it was safe to be in public on their way to a group. They got a couple of quotes here. Somebody said, I found many groups are filled with people who have harmful views and are not educated on politics around being queer or respecting persons of colour or different cultures. And they've said, I don't feel safe in spaces that don't explicitly state they're safe for LGBTQIA people. And then we asked people about access and inclusion ideas, things that work well for them or that they would like to see in groups. And there's so many quotes here that I'm going to run over, but there's some good suggestions. Clear expectations of how the groups run, what activities will take place at what times, and who to contact to ask about accessibility queries. Obviously very important. Oh, my window's disappeared again. Give me a sec. They wanted things like, even in small crafty meetups, they felt that it was often too loud or too bright. And, you know, they found that, I find that quite draining and hard to engage in. So I understand how that would be. So, you know, they're looking for craft groups or board game groups or whatever with calmer, lower levels of lighting, maybe even encouragement to listen on headphones so that it was possible to just be around people but not necessarily talking. Neurodiversity inclusive policies like flexible arrival and departure times, explicitly including the start and end times of an event, and all sorts of information about the other accessibility of a venue, photos of the venue, making sure there's a quiet space, and that, you know, you're explicit about accepting stimming and other behaviours. Having disability and neurodiversity policy, which is actually explained to people at the group. So yeah, I could go on with examples of what people have, but I suspect that most people here would be familiar with most of them. But one of the things I've been really enjoying is just seeing people asking for some of the same things that I know that I need.